It's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to present our work. Today I'll be presenting our findings on salt, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. And it's only fitting to present on salt, given my visit yesterday to the beautiful Dead Sea region. Just wonderful. Now, cardiovascular researchers and policy advocates have long labeled dietary sodium as a holy grail nutrient for reducing blood pressure and presumably to reduce cardiovascular disease. But is this supported by evidence, or is it in large part conjecture? That is it an overzealous extrapolation of limited data? This will be really the focus of today's talk. Now, a brief historical overview. Great, thank you very much. That's great, thank you. A brief historical overview. Now, salt has been a pivotal ingredient in the transition from hunter and gatherer communities to settler communities. So salt is much more than just a taste enhancer. It also has been used in the preservation of foods in winter months, and therefore also essential to survival. Now, salt has also been an early trading commodity. In fact, the word salary is derived from the Latin word salarium, which was money paid to Roman soldiers to buy salt. Now, a little more recently, in the early 1960s, doll rats were fed extremely large amounts of salt and developed chronic hypertension. Now, it's important to mention only rats that were selectively bred to be susceptible to blood pressure responses to salt showed blood pressure increases, whereas the salt-resistant rats did not. Anyway, this was the basis of the first research on salt and blood pressure, Dahl and his salt-sensitive rats. Then in 1970, the National Academy of Science Committee concluded that the evidence incriminating salt as causing hypertension was inconclusive. But nevertheless, the food industry saw an opportunity to market low-salt dietary products in much the same way they targeted low-fat at that time, which is the topic of tomorrow's talk. And in the 1970s and early 1980s, despite an absence of published studies, U.S. federal agencies largely embraced salt reduction, and later the WHO as well. And so the claim that excess salt intake is harmful gradually became prevailing wisdom. And when something becomes prevailing wisdom, it's very resistant to change. Even though in the next 30 to 40 years, the science on salt has evolved enormously. But when something becomes dogma, it's very resistant to change. And this is certainly the case for salt. So now the current recommendations on salt are that according to the WHO, as well as national guidelines like the American Heart Association or the USDA, is that people consume less than, well, anywhere between less than 2 grams per day to less than 2.4 grams per day. And some guidelines recommend even lower amounts, like less than 1.5 grams per day. Now, that's a very low amount of salt, and very few people can consume that little and sustain it for long periods of time. So achieving these targets will require substantial change to the diet for most people. So the current approaches to sodium reduction is a population-wide approach. That is, to get the entire population distribution down from the current average of about 3.5 to 4 grams per day, which we see predominantly in Western countries, down to about 2.3 grams per day as an interim goal, and then eventually in the long term to get the total population average to about 1.5 grams per day. Now, is this 35 to 65% reduction in sodium consumption in millions of people, and in fact, if we're talking globally, we really mean billions of people, necessary, safe, and feasible? Well, the crux of the argument is that the blood pressure lowering effect of a reduction in sodium will also reduce cardiovascular disease. So the current approach and the current guidelines on sodium are based on one number, blood pressure. Everything else is ignored. Any other effect on other biochemical marker is completely ignored. It's assumed that there is a single pathophysiological mechanism, and it's through blood pressure, and nothing else is affected. But is this supported by the evidence? Well, let's first start looking at some of the observational studies of sodium and blood pressure. Now, the InterSalt study is the most often quoted. It was published in the British Medical Journal in 1988, a global study, 52 centers around the world, 10,000 people, and they found a weak relationship between sodium and blood pressure, approximately a 1 millimeter mercury increase in systolic pressure per gram increase in sodium. Now, in the Scottish Heart Study, published in the same issue of the British Medical Journal as InterSalt, found no relationship at all between sodium and blood pressure in an equally well-conducted study. But in the next 3 decades that followed, it's InterSalt that's always quoted, and yet the Scottish Heart Study is largely ignored. Now, more recently, this is data presented this year in the experimental biology meeting in Chicago. They looked at data from the Framingham Offspring study, looking at sodium intake and blood pressure over a 16-year follow-up. The blue line is data for people with low sodium intake, less than 2.5 grams per day, while the green and red line is medium and high sodium. And you can see low sodium intake is associated with higher blood pressure over the 16-year follow-up period compared to moderate or high sodium. So it's in fact an inverse relationship. And actually this is in keeping with previous data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey in the US 30 years ago that found, in fact, higher sodium was related to a modestly lower level of blood pressure. But anyway, the point is, in free-living populations, the relationship between sodium and blood pressure is largely modest and may even be an inverse relationship. Now, looking at the randomized controlled trials, the DASH trial is by far the most widely cited study. And in fact, it's the primary basis for the current AHA guidelines and the USDA guidelines on salt. Now, the DASH trial was a proof of concept study as to whether changes in multiple aspects of the diet, including sodium, will reduce blood pressure. And participants were provided food during the course of the 5 weeks of the study. And so this was a proof of concept study. It was an excellent study because it was a feeding study, but it was not designed to assess if sodium reduction also reduces cardiovascular disease and mortality in free-living populations. And so DASH is just one of many randomized controlled trials. Here you see a forest plot showing a summary of 71 randomized trials of people with normal blood pressure, normotensive individuals. You see collectively, some trials have shown sodium reduction reducing systolic pressure. Most of the trials have shown neutrality, and a few have shown an increase in blood pressure. DASH is one of all these studies, and that's the one that is the basis for current recommendations. It's worth noting that the current degree of reduction in blood pressure with sodium reduction is only a 0.37 millimeter mercury decrease in systolic pressure per gram change in sodium. Now that's a very small effect in blood pressure, considering that, remember, 1 gram is large from a population perspective, and that would only translate into a modest change in blood pressure. So that brings us to the work we're doing. Now, the bread and butter of an epidemiologist is to measure exposure. If you can measure the exposure, then you've got a pretty good head start on doing a good study, just like any other area of science. So measurement is important. So we've spent a great amount of time finding ways, novel and innovative approaches to measure sodium intake for use in large population studies. Now, the 24-hour urine is the reference method for measuring sodium intake in populations. But unfortunately, it's not feasible for large studies, and under-collection is a problem. So you think of a large population study, from a lot of countries, low and middle income countries, a lot of field workers or manual workers, they're not going to collect 24-hour urines. It's not feasible, so you need new approaches. And so a fasting morning urine has been used to estimate 24-hour excretion using a mathematical formula developed by Kawasaki in 1993. So we developed and validated a widely practical method to estimate 24-hour urinary excretion in multiple countries. So we took a fasting morning urine from over 1,000 people in Pure in 11 countries around the world. And we estimated sodium and potassium using the Kawasaki formula. And estimated excretion was validated against actual 24-hour urine collections. And here you see the results for estimated versus measured 24-hour excretion. On the left here, you see the scatter plot with estimated excretion on the x-axis and measured excretion on the y-axis. In general, you see good correlation and agreement between the two measures, with an intra-class correlation coefficient of 0.71 and a test-retest reliability coefficient of 0.68. That's pretty good, considering it's a very simple method, a morning fasting urine, to estimate excretion. And then on the right, you see the results for sodium excretion versus systolic pressure. So with sodium excretion on the x-axis, systolic pressure on the y-axis, and the dark circles are measured excretion, the white circles are estimated excretion. You could see with both of the measures, there's a positive association with blood pressure. Secondly, you see that at each level of sodium, the mean blood pressure level is similar. So you could see that the use of a morning fasting urine to estimate excretion is very robust for use in large population studies. For clinical settings, to assess individuals, we would still use a 24-hour collection. But for large population studies, this is a very robust method. And some people have criticized the use of single measurements to assess exposure. And this is really silly when you think about it, because single measurements have been the basis of really the foundation of epidemiology, looking at the Framingham study, looking at single measures of systolic pressure related to coronary heart disease and stroke, single measures of non-fasting triglycerides, single measures of blood cholesterol, and also blood glucose versus health outcomes. You can see this approach has been widely used traditionally in epidemiology, so it's really just bunk this attack on a single method, because with large numbers, you would drown out random measurement error. Now, this brings us to the first of our two papers published in the New England Journal of Medicine. In the first one, we looked at the association of urinary sodium and potassium with blood pressure. So here we look at cross-sectional data in the PURE study. And I'll tell you more about PURE today and tomorrow as well as we go along. But PURE involves an unbiased selection of people from the general population in 667 urban and rural communities in 18 countries on 5 continents. And in this analysis, we focus on 102,000 people where we had urinary samples aged 35 to 70 years. And we applied our urinary method that I described to estimate excretion, and we did regression analyses to assess the association of sodium with blood pressure, adjusting for covariates. Now here you see systolic blood pressure change per gram increase in sodium. Overall, you see about a 2.1 millimeter mercury increase in systolic pressure per gram increment in sodium. Also, you see that there's differences across subpopulations. You see much steeper slopes in people consuming high levels of sodium than people in the lower end of the distribution. You also see a steeper association in hypertensives than in non-hypertensives, and in older people than in younger people. And this is expected, considering hypertensives and older people are more salt sensitive, so you would expect to see a steeper association. So this is in keeping with what we know and provides further validation of the use of our measurement for large population studies. Now this figure shows the percent of the global population with a sodium intake that meets current guidelines. The red line is estimated excretion based on a single urinary measurement. The blue line is after correction for random error, regression to the mean. You see with the red line, you see that only 3% of the global population meets the 2.3 gram per day recommendation, and less than 1% meets the 1.5 gram per day recommendation. After we adjust for random error, nobody meets the recommendation. So basically what we recommend is what nobody eats. So we're recommending something where there's no human experience. Now, up to now, I've only presented blood pressure data. Now I'm going to show you some of our results on clinical events, cardiovascular events, and mortality, which really are the most important outcomes, right? So this is data from the On-Target study. Back in 2009, we first saw this when we analyzed our data. And so this is on target. So this is people that are high risk for cardiovascular disease. They've all had a cardiovascular event in the past, and so it's high risk. And they had a 56-month follow-up. Morning fasting urines were collected, and we estimated excretion using the same method I described. We had 4,700 clinical events accrued during the follow-up, which included mortality, stroke, heart attacks, and heart failure events. And you could see the results. We found a U-shaped pattern or J-shaped pattern. Some people call it J-shaped or some U-shaped, where there's a sweet spot in the middle between about 3 to 6 grams per day, where being in the middle was optimal. If you exceeded that this range and above 6 grams, you see an increased risk. But at the low end, you also see an increased risk. So if you meet the current USDA recommendation of 1,500 milligrams, you would put yourself at increased risk for cardiovascular disease events. And so we sat on this data for 2 years, and we tried to make this relationship go away, and it wouldn't go away, no matter how we analyzed the data. So we published it in the Journal of the American Medical Association. We went into this with no preconceptions, and this is what we found, so we reported it. Now, it's important to note that this is on target. The on-target studies, that's high-risk population. And there's always the potential for reverse causation. So for instance, you could have the sickest people eating the lowest sodium diet, right? So reverse causation. Now, even though we took steps to minimize that in sensitivity analyses, nothing is foolproof. And so you can't completely rule it out. So because it is a high-risk population. And the majority of participants were on RAS blockers. So that brings us to the second of our 2 papers in the New England Journal. This one, we looked at urinary sodium and potassium versus mortality and cardiovascular events from the, again, from the PURE study. Again, focusing on about 102,000 people with urine samples. About 8% had a prior history of cardiovascular disease. We used the same method to measure sodium I described. We had about 3,300 clinical events accrued during 3.7 years of follow-up, with 95% of follow-up completed, and we used multivariable modeling to assess associations while controlling for known confounders. And we also assessed potential for reverse causality. So this is the findings showing the cubic splines of sodium versus the important outcomes of primary composite outcome, death from any cause, and major cardiovascular events. And you see for all 3 events, you see a similar pattern of results, a J-shaped relationship. So being in the middle was optimal. Exceeding about 6 grams per day, you see an increased risk. And being below 3 grams per day, you see an increased risk. In fact, the slope was steeper at the low end than at the high end. So again, we see the same classic pattern, the sweet spot in the middle. And that's true for all of the outcomes. Now, we did extensive multivariable modeling to assess confounding and reverse causation. You see in the multivariable model, adjusting for all known confounders, we see that the slope estimates are still robust. And then we further adjusted for LDL, HDL cholesterol ratio, and dietary factors like fruit and vegetable intake. Again, we see the estimates are unaltered. Then we further excluded people with cardiovascular disease and cancer to assess the potential for reverse causation. Again, you see the parameter estimates remain the same. And then we looked at a very low risk cohort and found, again, if anything, the effect at the low end was amplified when you do that. So again, the results were unchanged. And then we further excluded people with events in the first 24 months. And again, the results remained the same. So we did everything humanly possible in analyzing the data. Again, the results were robust. So Susan Opperl, in her commentary in the New England Journal, commented, "These provocative findings beg for a randomized controlled outcome trial to compare reduced sodium intake with usual diet. In the absence of such a trial, the results argue against reduction of dietary sodium as an isolated public health recommendation." Now, regardless of how you measure sodium intake, whether it's 24-hour urine, early morning fasting urine, or food frequency questionnaires, you still see a similar pattern of associations. So this is different studies using different methods to estimate sodium: 24-hour urine, early morning urine, again, early morning urine, and of course, a fruit frequency questionnaire in the lower right. Again, it's a similar pattern regardless of the methods to measure sodium. Now, some argue that, no, you have to do 24-hour urines. You cannot use a morning fasting urine. Well, even studies that use 24-hour urine collections find the same results. So this is people with type 2 diabetes using 24-hour urinary collections. We find that lower sodium is related to higher risk of all-cause mortality compared to people with higher sodium, and the effect was dose responsive. This is another paper published in JAMA 2011. This, again, using 24-hour urine collections in healthy adults this time. Again, we find lower sodiums related to higher risk of cardiovascular deaths compared to higher sodium. So again, it goes in the inverse direction. And this is a meta-analysis by Grottle published last year in the American Journal of Hypertension, where he looked at the data from all of the prospective cohort studies comparing low sodium to average sodium in populations. And what he found was that in each case, you see a consistent pattern where in each time, usual sodium wins out against low sodium. And so it's not just pure that shows this. This has been replicated across many different studies showing that low sodium does worse than average sodium. Okay, now last year there was another study published called the CRIC study, C-R-I-C. They looked at sodium excretion and risk of cardiovascular events in patients with chronic kidney disease. Now, at first glance, you would say, well, okay, this is indication that sodium intake is associated with higher risk. But if you note, you have to pay close attention to the x-axis. You start to see an increased risk when you exceed about 5 grams per day. And so there's no argument from us that high sodium is harmful. Certainly when you reach a certain level, you achieve toxicity and you get an increased risk. But at the average level, where most populations fall, between 3 to 5 grams, you see that the curves are largely flat, or if anything, may even go up at the low end. You also see the confidence intervals are very wide at the low end, again indicating very few people consume low amounts of salt. And this is their findings when they present them by quartiles, focusing on their primary outcome. The reference group is less than 2.9 grams per day, all the way up to greater than 4.5 grams per day. And you look at their different modeling estimates, you see no increase in risk all the way up to about 4.5 grams per day. It's only when intake goes above 4.5 grams per day where they see an increase in the risk. And this is using multiple 24-hour urine collections, the most rigorous approach you're ever going to find to measuring sodium. And so still, it does not show that low is better than moderate. So in fact, I can say that there's not one single study ever that has shown low sodium doing better than average sodium intake, regardless of how you measure sodium, versus clinical events, heart attack, stroke, or mortality. And then lastly, I would like to present the findings from our paper last year in the Lancet. Now we pulled together 4 studies, data from 4 studies, and looked at data from 133,000 people, Pure, EpiDream, OnTarget, and Transcend. And this is what we got. At the top here, you see the results overall in 133,000 people. You see, again, the classic U-shaped pattern, where, again, between 3 to 6 grams per day was optimal. Higher amounts and lower amounts were associated with increased risk. And the bottom 2 panels, you see the results for those with hypertension and those without hypertension. You see that at the lower end, low intake was associated with increased risk in both hypertensives and non-hypertensives. So therefore, the harmful effect of low sodium is observed regardless of blood pressure level. At the high end, you see an increased risk, but only in the people with hypertension. There was no effect in the people without hypertension. This suggests that we're better off targeting people with hypertension that also consume high amounts of sodium, which is about 10% of the global population we found. For the other 90%, there was no basis to doing any population-wide recommendation. So targeted approach seems more appropriate. And then we looked at it versus blood pressure. Again, we confirmed the findings from Pure. We see a positive association between sodium and blood pressure, which is steeper in people with hypertension than people without hypertension by about twice the magnitude, which is consistent with what we know. So this provides further validation of the accuracy of our measurement for use in large population studies. Now, why would low sodium be harmful? Well, there is a lot of data showing that low sodium is associated with activation of the renin-angiotensin system. This was a classic paper by Bruner in 1972 in the New England Journal showing an exponential rise in plasma renin and aldosterone with low sodium. Exponential. So, and this has been largely ignored, focusing again only on blood pressure. A Cochrane review by Grotto in 2012 showed again, collectively looking at the data from intervention studies, increases with low sodium, increases in renin, aldosterone, also trends for epinephrine and norepinephrine, and also increases in triglycerides. So certainly there is a basis to explain the potential adverse effects of low sodium intake. Just want to briefly mention that sodium is an essential nutrient, and we know that essential nutrients have both a toxicity level at the high end and a deficiency level at the low end. So it stands to reason that you would see a U-shaped association, which has also been found for other dietary variables that are essential to the body. Why would sodium be any different? And then lastly, I'd like to mention that randomized controlled trials are the standard for assessing the efficacy and safety of an intervention. Unfortunately, there are no randomized controlled trials of sodium and clinical events, so we definitely need randomized controlled trials. TOPE was a randomized trial, but it was focused on blood pressure. In the extended follow-up of TOPE, they reported a weak trend for a benefit, but it was not statistically significant or clear-cut. They also had large losses to follow-up. 23% were lost to follow-up. Further, 1/3 had missing information on the outcome. 40% of the data was missing on outcomes. So we need data from randomized controlled trials if we are to make low sodium recommendations. So to conclude, sodium intake is related to blood pressure, but the effect is modest in those without hypertension. The association between sodium and blood pressure is nonlinear. And you notice the J-shaped pattern across studies. Increased the risk of mortality is found with high sodium above 6 grams per day, but only in hypertensives. Modestly lower sodium below 3 grams is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular events in hypertensives and non-hypertensives. 3/4 of the population consumes 3 to 6 grams, which is associated with lowest risk. We have a pathophysiological mechanism identified. There's no net health benefit in healthy or at-risk individuals. And there are concerns about safety with too little sodium intake. So a targeted approach rather than a population approach appears to be more reasonable at present, that is targeting hypertensive individuals who also consume high levels of sodium. So as IOM committee chair Brian Strom stated, it's not a question of studies showing a benefit being better than studies showing harm. There are no studies showing benefit. Okay, thank you very much.